The fourth argument for the compatibility of atheism and liberty is the freedom from subjugation to lesser men. Any atheist of integrity would join any theist of integrity in decrying the abuses of authority perpetrated by both political and religious figures. Exposing and condemning abuses of authority does not require atheism or advocacy of laissez-faire. However, both the atheist and the advocate of laissez-faire stand in a superior position with regard to preventing the damage to them caused by abuses of authority, as well as warning others of the possibility of such abuses. Many well-intentioned and honest Catholics, for instance, had for decades seen as legitimate interpreters of the Word of God men who had during the same time engaged in the most horrendous acts of child abuse. These same Catholics were rightly horrified upon finding out that such abuse had taken place, and thereafter most of them repudiated the abusers. However, is it not better to not submit oneself unconditionally to a potential abuser in the first place? It is possible to have a benevolent priest, and indeed I have met such persons. But it is also possible to have a benevolent dictator, or a benevolent central committee with absolute power, but with the best intentions. However, the advocate of liberty rejects grants of absolute power to even the most benevolent of persons, because of the lack of certainty in such benevolence. The precedent this would set for the assumption of similar power by less benevolent men, and the impossibility of even the most benevolent rulers to competently plan the lives of others, due to the calculation problem and the knowledge problem discussed by Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek. When lesser men obtain political power, more than mere governmental inefficiency may result, but torture, sadism, and carnage are likely outcomes. Likewise, when lesser men obtain religious authority, we can expect to witness perversions of morality, including hypocrisy, promiscuity, adultery, sexual abuse, intellectual dishonesty, and the condemnation and punishment of innocent persons within the religious institution. However, there is no reliable mechanism for ensuring that only persons of honesty and integrity always rise to positions of either political or religious authority. The proper remedy, then, is to jettison any unconditional reliance on authority, and to treat every holder of power as being perpetually on trial, always to be scrutinized in his decisions and actions, and never to be acceded to by virtue of his status alone. Reason, and not position, ought to determine whether a person's moral and philosophical counsels are followed, just as reason, and not position, ought to determine the legitimacy of the actions of a government office holder. The individual rank-and-file believer in a particular religious faith is often morally superior to the higher authorities of that faith. Atheism offers such persons the opportunity to no longer be subject to the often unreliable and perverse wishes of such lesser men, and instead to take charge of their own lives and decisions, which they can do much more competently when guided by their own intellect rather than by external pronouncements. The fifth argument for the compatibility of atheism and liberty is the freedom to refine one's views. The institutions which make political liberty possible are not static. They must adapt to changing technological and cultural circumstances, and interpret these changes in a manner that is consistent with the maximal freedom of every individual. The political theory of liberty will always continue to evolve as new areas of dispute arise, and new developments in technology and society raise questions that have not been addressed by the existing theory. Certainly, fixing the theory of liberty at any stage of development would render it impotent to deal with new problems and challenges. But many religions attempt precisely to fix their theoretical understanding of morality, or worse, of nature itself, at some point in those religions' historical development. This endeavor inevitably fails, as no set of ideas can ever be fixed so firmly as to disallow the possibility of new and creative interpretations. Moreover, most of the prominent world religions still adhere to millennia-old texts, which by those religions' precepts cannot be revised or improved upon. While the interpretation of those texts has certainly evolved over time, it was not possible for adherents to those religions to jettison parts of the texts, which have since been found to be blatantly immoral, such as God's punishment of Saul for failing to perpetrate sufficient genocide upon Amalek. After ruthlessly exterminating the men, women, and children of Amalek, Saul did not do the same to the best animals, and instead offered them as a sacrifice to God. Most Christians and Jews today would agree that genocide is immoral in all cases, but they are not allowed by their religion to reject the idea of God as explicitly commanding such genocide. They are thus barred from fully developing a coherent and relevant theory of morality, just as individuals who would freeze the theory of liberty at a certain historical point are barred from fully developing coherent and relevant understandings of liberty. An atheist is not unconditionally bound to any person, any text, or any concrete institution. As new developments shed light on previous errors and as new questions arise, the atheist is free to develop intellectual and institutional innovations to address these issues. An atheist can thereby become the best friend of liberty and the best innovator who works in developing liberty's new applications and enabling it to overcome new challenges.